During the First World War, the armed forces employed 66,000 supply trucks for the war effort. When hostilities ceased, they were sold as military surplus and converted for civilian use. For the first time, road haulage became a major industry, cheaper and more flexible than goods trains, and capable of delivering directly from door to door without having to be processed through goods yards. This was bad news for the rail companies, whose business model required that half their services should carry freight. At the same time, cars and buses were growing in number and were sapping passengers away. Together with providing such a great boost for the roads, the war had left the railways in a very weak position. Though the companies had been compensated for the stock which had been given in war work, the war had disrupted much of their infrastructure and delayed many upgrades in their stock. Many of their engines were now 20 years out of date, and the subsequent recession, together with the influenza pandemic, caused their business to suffer, making it very hard to recover. At the same time, Ireland splitting away from the UK was a further blow to rail companies and investors who owned sections of their network. One way the companies attempted to balance the books was to announce wage cuts and increased hours for their workers. Naturally, the unions did not take kindly to the announcement and organised a nationwide strike as a protest. The strike lasted 9 days, during which the country came to a grinding halt. The strike finally came to an end when the government and the companies agreed to maintain wages as they were for another year. Further negotiation led to the government passing laws setting a nationwide standard in rail workers' wages and limiting their working time to 8 hours a day. The government also agreed amongst themselves that it should be their policy to work with the unions rather than against them. Unfortunately, they did not take the same approach with coal miners. The coal industry was also suffering in the fallout of the First World War. In 1926, it was recommended that a 13% reduction in wage be levelled against the miners. The Miners' Federation of Great Britain began to organise a strike. But the General Council of the Trades Union Congress believed that more extreme action was needed, as similar issues were hitting many industries. In May 1926, they organised a general strike, the biggest ever to hit Britain, with 1.7 million workers walking out. Though the rail workers had no grievances of their own, they joined the strike in sympathy, together with transport workers, dock workers, iron workers and steel workers. Unfortunately, the government had been planning for this eventuality. They organised ways to work around the strikers and encouraged the companies to offer special privileges to those willing to cross the picket line so that the industries could continue running, albeit at a reduced level. These workers were commended by their employers but permanently despised by the working classes, who shut them out of all social functions and labelled them blackleg workers. Armed militia were deployed to protect those still at work, which naturally meant there were acts of violence on both sides. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, was narrowly dissuaded from ordering the soldiers to use live ammunition if necessary. After 9 days, the unions were forced to call off the strike. The rail workers were able to return without too much trouble, but the miners were forced to accept great wage reductions. The leaders of the general strike came to regard it as a mistake, which hurt their cause rather than helping. The government passed legislation outlawing general strikes and sympathy strikes. They did, however, look into the possibility of a nationwide minimum wage, and a recommendation that workers' wage reductions should be mirrored by a proportional reduction in corporate profits. The general strike also served to show how quickly the railways were losing ground to the roads. While the 1919 strike had brought everything to a halt, this time the country had been able to work around the absence of the railways with relatively little trouble, now that buses and lorries were more readily available for their transport needs. The strikes didn't exactly help in that regard, as many turned to alternatives during the strikes and didn't always come back. It was clear that serious reorganisation was required to help the railways rebuild after the war. The Executive Committee, which had run the network during the conflict, highlighted a number of advantages to having a more central authority over the railways. This led to renewed calls to nationalise the network, but these were blocked by the company owners. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A series of mergers would be overseen by the government, amalgamating 120 small companies into 4 big ones, colloquially known as the Big Four. Each company would oversee a given region of the country. After some debate about how best to arrange these regions, it was decided to divide mainland Britain up into wedges like cake, with London at the centre. That way, each company could run direct services from the capital to the far reaches of the country. On the 1st of January 1923, the mergers were finalised and the Big Four came into being. The London and North Eastern Railway, the London Midland and Scottish Railway, the Great Western Railway, and the Southern Railway. Because the regions were organised along company lines rather than geographically, it led to a lot of quirks in the outcome, with many overlaps, shared lines, panhandles, and enclaves. Though Northern Ireland was not part of the grouping plans, LMS inherited a third of the network there. Even more bizarrely, they inherited 2 short routes in the Irish Free State. Despite an uneven appearance, the grouping was a very successful system. The Big Four could take advantage of the tools and talent of their constituent companies, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. The government could bring in nationwide changes more easily, as 4 big companies were easier to deal with than hundreds of small ones. And the grouping allowed for just the right level of rivalry between the companies to spur themselves on without ending up working against each other. To compete with the roads, the companies endeavoured to use their newfound power to modernise the network. Not only would they replace their worn-out stock, they would push ahead and become world-leading in innovation. For the Southern Railway, modernisation took the form of widespread electrification. Their network was the shortest of the Big Four and largely consisted of slower commuter routes, making it ideal for widespread electrification. In 1923, less than 40 kilometres of their track was electrified. By the time of the Second World War, that number had risen to over 300. A faster rate of electrification than ever managed under British Rail. The government had set the 1,500-volt overhead cable as the standard for electrification in 1921, but Southern chose to ignore this and electrified everything using a 660-volt third rail, creating a divide which exists in the country to this very day. Great Western, meanwhile, were experimenting with the emerging field of diesel power. In 1923, they introduced their first diesel railcar between London and Reading, the first long-distance diesel service in the world, capable of hitting 130 kilometres an hour in service and carrying 104 passengers. By the time of nationalisation, they would introduce 36 more of these railcars, running light passenger and parcel services all over their network. But the main focus of each company was in building better steam engines. Their amalgamation of talent allowed them to produce engines which represented the pinnacle of steam technology. The engineers made many improvements to the boilers, furnaces and feed pipes, but one of the most notable advances was the widespread adoption of the Walschaerts valve gear. Steam engines rarely use gearboxes. Instead, the torque output is adjusted by varying how often steam is injected into the cylinder. When it is moving slowly, steam is injected throughout the stroke, as all the power is required to get the engine up to speed. But at higher speeds, momentum does much of the work, and constantly feeding steam in causes the boiler to rapidly depressurise. And so, a complicated arrangement of cranks and levers is used, which can be adjusted from the driver's cab, so that feed is closed off entirely in mid-stroke, saving steam. Robert Stephenson introduced the first valve gears in 1841, but the Walschaerts valve gear represented a dramatic improvement, as it could be adjusted to much finer increments, and at its higher setting, steam would only be fed in for around 60% of the stroke, compared to 80% for the Stephenson valve gear. What's more, it was on the outside of the wheel, which meant it could be adjusted quite easily at the track side, without having to take the engine back to the sheds. These improvements meant the trains could be run at high speeds for longer without wearing out the engine, as had happened with previous speed runs. Pre-grouping services rarely exceeded 80 kilometres an hour. In 1923, Great Western began pushing the boundary with the Cheltenham Spa Express, which ran from Swindon to Paddington, averaging nearly 100 kilometres an hour start to stop. Whereas the pre-grouping companies had used hundreds of different types of engine between themselves, the Big Four could use relatively few classes in big numbers. Not only did this make it easier to supply spare parts, it also made publicity more impactful. Each company quickly developed a flagship high-speed express class featured on posters and tours everywhere. LNER had their A1 Pacific class, LMS had their Royal Scot class, Great Western had their Castle class, and Southern had their King Arthur class. Not only did the classes become famous, but so did many individual engines. Giving each a distinctive name gave each a distinctive character, just like ships. For instance, school children and commuters would become familiar with the engine that would carry them each way every day, almost seeming like another co-worker. But none would capture the public imagination more than the A1 Pacific class locomotive LNER assigned to pull their daily express service between London and Edinburgh. Both the engine and the service were known as the Flying Scotsman. In 1928, the service was modified to a non-stop service. At 632 kilometres, it was the longest non-stop service in the world at the time. Water was regularly replenished through troughs in the track, and a special tender was designed which could hold over 9 metric tons of coal. A non-stop service also meant that the crew would need to be changed over on the move, and so a special corridor was built into the tender. Chief Engineer Nigel Gresley reportedly calculated how large to make this passageway by arranging chairs in his dining room and finding the smallest gap he could comfortably squeeze through. He was a large man, and he reasoned that if he could fit, so could his crews. Existing arrangements, following the races to the north, legally set the fastest time at which an East Coast mainline train could run between London and Edinburgh as 8.5 hours, which meant that in the early days, the Flying Scotsman had to average just 75 kilometres an hour, less than half of what it was capable of. The speed would be increased later, but in the early days, it served to make the service smooth and comfortable for both driver and passenger. But the Flying Scotsman's main attraction was not just in speed, but in luxury. The Big Four each endeavoured to make their long-distance services feel more like luxury liners than simple forms of transport. The Flying Scotsman featured not only seating and dining carriages, but a cocktail bar, a ladies' retiring room, and even a barber shop. Not every company was affected by grouping. Many of the small local services stayed independent. London's subterranean railways were a major example. The Metropolitan Railway, which did not become part of the London Underground until 1933, had been expanding into rural Buckinghamshire over the years to link up with other lines, extending as far as Verney Junction, 80 kilometres from central London. The law required for companies building lines to buy not only the land within the track bed, but also within a certain distance to either side. Normally, this would be sold back after the line was complete, but a clause allowed the Metropolitan to keep it for future development. In 1919, they enacted a scheme they had been discussing since before the war to develop housing in these areas. It was advertised to offer Londoners an opportunity to live in the pleasant countryside, but with convenient train access to central London. The scheme was a great success, and the London Underground partnered with housing developers to conduct similar schemes all round the city. The lines expanded out into the home counties, using much cheaper above-ground track, and the city expanded with them, creating hectares and hectares of leafy suburbs with similar-looking Art Deco and Mock Tudor styles in a ring around the city. The area became known as Metroland. The rate at which the city expanded soon came back to bite. Home counties commuters would move into these new developments to be close to the country, but then more housing estates would build up around them. The railway would extend further into the country, and more housing would build up around that. Before long, the countryside they had moved to be close to was nowhere to be seen. In 1928, mainland Britain's rail network reached its greatest extent ever, with 34,000 kilometres of track. But even at the time, it was clear that this was not to last. Passenger numbers, which had risen steadily through the 19th century, were now fluctuating badly. Meanwhile, goods traffic was steadily dropping. And for all the grandeur and innovation of the Big Four, they were not financially successful. Only LNER were turning over a profit, and then barely. The companies relied on government subsidies to function. The world was changing, and the railways would need to reinvent themselves for this new age. Some of their attempts to do so will be covered next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, share and subscribe to help the channel grow. And why not check out my website for more examples of my artwork. I am currently working on part 12, which should be with you in the next couple of months. Bye for now.